Good morning. My name's Tom McNally, and I'm the Dean of Libraries, and I'm thrilled to welcome you this morning. You survived the chill, you found a place to park, you got in a building. Congratulations. I especially want to welcome those individuals and their families who have entrusted their papers and other materials to our library. If you had a chance to look at the cases, you may have seen some familiar items. I hope you got a chance to look at some of the news footage in the lobby. You might have seen yourself. You might have seen friends looking just a little bit younger. I also want to welcome the elected officials who are here today, community leaders, university administrators, faculty, staff, and students. We're honored to have you all and grateful that you've taken your time to be with us today for this announcement. It's now my pleasure to introduce the president of the University of South Carolina, Dr. Harris Bastides.
History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. The late Maya Angelou's words, spoken at President Bill Clinton's inauguration on January 21, 1993, ring true on this morning for our campus, for our state, and for the United States of America. In 2013, I think everybody here will remember that we commemorated the 50th anniversary of USC's desegregation. Two of the students who participated as trailblazers and pioneers, we heard from them on that day, Henri Monteith Treadwell and James Solomon, known to many of you here. In preparing for that event, I read a lot, and I learned about the role that South Carolina had in national events that were never taught to me as a schoolboy in public schools in New York City. Bad enough, but I'm pretty sure they weren't and aren't taught in South Carolina schools either. That commemoration was also a poignant reminder that change often, almost always comes only with great sacrifice, courage, and continued hard work, as Congressman Clyburn and so many of you who are here this morning with us can attest to. So understanding this, the University of South Carolina is renewing its commitment to keep pressing forward, and today's announcement is a big and correct step in the right direction. By 2013, when we recognized the desegregation, we had already, under the leadership of Dean Tom McNally and Herb Hartsook and others, built a substantial political collection with works from key South Carolina figures, but we soon realized that we needed more. We needed to establish an additional initiative at the university that would zero in on this state's unique civil rights history. And we realized as well that the place needed to be accessible to students and faculty and scholars from around the United States and worldwide. So the Center for Civil Rights, History, and Research will be that place and will house an already substantial but growing collection that will provide the current and all future generations with the stories, and many of you know the stories of the ongoing struggle for equality and social justice in South Carolina, which is truly not only a state story, it is the American story. The announcement is timely after the tragic summer at Mother Emanuel, followed by the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House ground. It became apparent that the center would absolutely play a critical role. The collections housed here will put current and past events into context, as we must, as Maya Angelou said, learn from the past so that we do not repeat it. This center will be nothing less than a place to spark conversation and dialogue, and if necessary, debate and difficult conversation, because nothing gets done or will get done without that. So it's my hope not only that we have a place to review our history, but we have a place to spark meaningful change in the state and in the United States. The center will become a central repository for South Carolina civil rights history, which, as I said before, is a central part of America's civil rights history. I'd now like to introduce, and it's a great privilege to introduce one of our great professors, one of the many great professors at the University of South Carolina, Professor of History, Bobby Donaldson, who chairs the Implementation Committee of the Center, and he will provide additional details. Please help me welcome Professor Bobby Donaldson.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. For those who know me, this is not my normal voice, and so bear with me as I collect myself from this past weekend when I was nearly speechless, probably because of the excitement of this morning. A week ago, last Monday, at this very hour, I joined students from our university in a march from Long Street Theater to Osborne Administration Building. And during that march, I reminded them that they were part of a legacy. Few knew the details of another march on March 2nd, 1961, when hundreds of students from around the state of South Carolina gathered at Zion Baptist Church on Washington Street for a planned march to the State House to challenge, quote, the guardians of the status quo. The protesters' stated purpose was, quote, to submit a protest to the citizens of South Carolina and the state legislature our feelings and our dissatisfaction with the present condition of discriminatory actions against Negroes. At the march, the Reverend David Carter, one of the leaders, said, "We are protesting the indignity and inhumanity of segregation." He encouraged the students and preached, "Do you want to go to jail? I don't think this is right. Let your conscience be your guide." And with that, the students broke out in song. They began clapping. They began dancing. They began singing songs like "We Shall Not Be Moved" and the anthem, "The Star-Spangled Banner." And for that, they were arrested for disturbing the peace. Among the 187 arrested that day were NAACP leaders Ida Quincy Newman, whose papers are housed in this library, and Dr. Benjamin J. Glover. Notable students who were there that day included the president of the NAACP Youth Council, Leola Robinson Simpson, currently a member of the General Assembly. Also a young man, student from South Carolina State, named James E. Clyburn. On the sidelines was a young student from Jura High School, who is now the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, Justice Jean Toll. 186 of these people had something in common. They knew by experience the indignity of segregation and Jim Crow. But there was one student who was an exception to those 186. He was a 17-year-old student from the University of South Carolina. His name was Frederick Hart. He was white. He was from Falls Church, Virginia. He was an aspiring artist. Hart tells his account that he is walking down Sumter Street and he sees the arrival of these young men and women coming from Zion. He reaches over to shake the hand of one of the African-American students, and a policeman looks at him and says, "Are you a member of the NAACP?" Frederick Hart says, "Yes, I just joined." His picture appeared in newspapers across the country. He was ridiculed, he was harassed, he was branded, quote, a highly emotional campus liberal by the Daily Gamecock. Undaunted, Fred Hart penned a letter in the Gamecock that said, "Sympathizing is not enough. I beg you to stand up for what you believe is right, this situation is appallingly unjust. To let it go on would be defeating the whole purpose of democracy. On March 17, 1961, he said, "If you're ever going to stand up now." He was harassed, he was heckled, and he ultimately decided to leave this university within weeks of the famous march at the State House. And he went on to a distinguished career as a sculptor and artist. I suspect those who joined Fred Hart that day knew something about the history of civil rights and social justice in our community. They knew something about George Elmore, Sarah Mae Fleming, and Briggs v. Elliott. They also knew something about the important role of Matthew J. Perry, whose oral history is housed in this library. Judge Perry was a successful attorney at that time, and he came to defend these young people, Fred Hart, David Carter, and Jim Clyburn. His success led to a lawsuit entitled Edwards v. South Carolina that was ruled on February 25, 1963, in an 8-1 decision that ruled the 14th Amendment forbids a state to make criminal the peaceful expression of unpopular views. The ruling that day was used in the famous march from Selma to Montgomery. It was used in the Birmingham campaign. It was used by the Columbia Occupy movement only a few years ago. But regrettably, this history and so many histories about the movement in our state that had an impact on our community and our nation are not widely known. Today we come to mark the beginning of a new Center for Civil Rights History and Research. But we also come to applaud the important groundwork established by so many who are here and many who are not. As we gather to mark this important milestone in our history, we look back over the past 4 decades. We look closely at individuals like Willie Hereford, who is here, Luther Batiste, who is here, and our great colleague, Grace Jordan McFadden, who envisioned a center and a program of the type that we're describing today. And we also applaud all the scholars across this campus, particularly those in African American studies, who've been working for decades to bring this dream to reality. It is the hope that this center will be a destination for interdisciplinary research and advocacy, for public education, the training of teachers, for museums and exhibits, to give those who want to know more about the important work of South Carolina a vehicle and a platform to tell more deeply the story for civil rights. In 2003, Dr. Bob Moore interviewed Chief Justice Ernest Finney in an oral interview. Judge Finney said the following, lamenting, "Why haven't we been able to tell the story of the civil rights movement and tell it in a manner that the young people particularly appreciate and understand?" This sentiment was shared to me a year or two ago on the stage of the Booker T. Washington High School. I gathered there with the president and others to have a meeting with Congressman Jim Clyburn and his wife, discussing why we need to do more as a university to tell the important story of civil rights and social justice in our community. And it was at that time he told us that he would be interested in discussing the possibility of having his congressional papers housed here at the University of South Carolina. And today we are very pleased to announce that he has agreed to house this important collection on our campus, and we thank him for his support and his ongoing advocacy. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Jim Clyburn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bobby, or Dr. Donaldson, whatever is appropriate. Thank you so much for your friendship, and thank you so much for presenting me here today. Dr. Pastides, Dean McNally, thanks to both of you. And it's so good to see so many of you here with whom I've had interactions over the years. Jack Bass and Bud Ferrillo, and the guy that I succeeded in the seat that I have now held for 23 years. He was there for 10. So good to see him here. I was just saying to Robin that hopefully his papers are here as well, give some continuity to the 6th Congressional District. He told me he hadn't decided whether he could run for office again, so his papers are here. But they were embargoed until he decided not to run again. And Mrs. Culberson, so good to see you again. I remember both of us were out and about trying to get John Bolt elected. It's interesting how these things happen. When I first found out that you did not have to live in the congressional district that you ran in, all you had to do was live in the state, was with John Bolt Culberson, because he was living up in Spartanburg when they came down to run for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District. And so I remember that very well. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Pastides and Dean McNally, and before them, John Carl West, have been after me for years about donating my papers to the University of South Carolina. Of course, you have a fantastic political collection here. I've seen a lot of it, impressed by it. And many of my current and former colleagues have deposited their papers at this institution. But my response to their request has always been that my concern extends beyond my papers. When I wrote my memoirs, I applied a 3-part test to every chapter. Will those 10th graders I used to teach understand what I just wrote? Would they learn a lesson from what I just wrote? Would they be motivated by what I wrote? I wanted my book to be life lessons to young, developing minds. My hope was, and still is, that my papers would one day be a part of that goal and a part of effort to tell South Carolina's story accurately and vividly, its history and its civil rights story. As Dr. Pastides has demonstrated time and time again, he is a good listener. I just told him as we talked before this program that I was very moved, impressed, and proud of his public response to the recent student walkout here at this institution. He is sensitive and responsive to the needs of his students and the state. That is why he has made such a strong leader of this, the flagship institution in our state. 2 of my daughters, I have 3 of them, one of which we're keeping our fingers crossed that her second child, our 4th grandchild, will not be born before we leave here. We got a call at 5 o'clock this morning indicating that that might be the case. But 2 of them, Mignon and Jennifer, are graduates of this institution. My wife, Emily, has a master's degree in library science from this institution. I spent 2 years in the law school here. I don't usually mention that in Emily's presence because she still has not forgiven me for being a dropout. But these are not the reasons I was persuaded to give my papers. I was persuaded because of the vision that night that Bobby talked about. When we sat around on the stage of the auditorium at Booker T. Washington Auditorium, Em and I, and we listened as Dr. Pastides spoke of his vision. Dean McNally, the intensity to which he seemed to feel for this subject. Hope Derrick and her long-standing association with me and my efforts. And then there's Bobby Donaldson, who I had met and had grown to admire and respect. He is the first guy that I ever sat down with who seemed to understand what 1963 was all about. It was that evening that I decided that the significant collection that is already here should be augmented by my congressional papers. I suspect if I were to mention a few names, many of you would probably have never heard of them. I'm originally from Sumter, where I was on yesterday, helping my home church celebrate their 110th anniversary. Something I decided to do over going to Santa Monica, California, where congressional leaders were. And I thought, as I drove away from that church on the way back here, Em and I took 378 out of Sumter, and I actually thought about James McBride Dabbs. Most people in South Carolina never heard the name. Dabbs Crossroad means a whole lot to me because as a child, I still remember the efforts that he made. He was a pretty wealthy white guy who had no real reason to be involved outside of his own internal being. But James McBride Dabbs, Alice Spearman, if my memory serves, a native of Hartsville, South Carolina. I don't know what would have happened to me, but it was Alice Spearman that said to one of my classmates, Elijah Rogers here, who then got in touch with me as I was down in Charleston teaching history at C.A. Brown High School, and told us about something that was about to happen. I don't know if we would have known had it not been for Alice Spearman. I don't know what her background was, but a white woman who certainly was moved by her own internal being. And so, when you look at McBride Dabbs, Alice Spearman, Sarah Fleming, the Gimke sisters of Charleston, I've always been intrigued by them. Way back, when few people were thinking about what could be done in the state, these people made so much of a contribution to things. And quite frankly, every child ought to know. I really believe that if more white children knew about McBride Dabbs and Alex Spearman and the Grimke sisters, many of them would have different attitudes about things. And if more black people knew, black students, about Sarah Fleming, Ida Quincy Newman, Matthew Perry, Ernest Finney, I think they would be motivated. And I'm looking forward to this effort because I knew on that evening that my papers would add significantly to the Senate and its mission. And as Dr. Donaldson has said, it's the hope of all of us that today's announcement will be the catalyst to add other important collections to this center. I would just love, on that day back in 1961, Jean Toll often tells me about how motivated she was going down to the courthouse and watching Matthew Perry perform on that day. She didn't know he was performing on my behalf. But we talked about that a lot. I have no idea what she plans to do with her stuff, but I can just envision people coming to the center and being able to see an incident and walk over to a cubicle or to a shelf and be able to, what do they call it, annotate? Emily's a librarian, I don't know all these words. But really see how those things interact with each other, all in one building. We want to see a one-stop research facility. And so for all of you who be nervous, I want to thank Mr. Fleming, where's Al Fleming? He's in there somewhere, from South Carolina State, with whom he runs the foundation at the school. So none of what we are doing here today, Emily and I, are at conflict with anything we're doing at, Dr. Evans, the president of South Carolina State. Thank you so much. Please stand and be recognized. Dr. Evans. I did not see him come in. So Bob has always been kind of nervous. So when I called Dr. Evans, I invited him to be here because in every discussion I've had with Bobby, he was so nervous about the people at South Carolina State not getting their nose out of joint. So now, is this proof that you're all right? So I want to thank all of you. I'll close with this little story. I was listening as Bobby went through that arrest that day back in 1961. I tell this story often, and it's in my book. On that day, I had decided I was not going to go to jail. And I came to Zion Baptist Church along with my roommate, dressed in a three-piece olive green suit, a gold shirt, and a paisley tie. And when Ida Quincy Newman saw me, he knew that going to jail was not on my mind. But he also knew that somebody had to go to jail that day because we were testing the new breach of the peace statute because all the states were losing those cases on disturbing the peace. And so the legislature had created this new statute called breach of the peace. And we had to test it. So Adi came back to me and said to me that I was dressed a little strange. Because, back then when we got ready to go to jail, we used to wear, most of them would wear coveralls. I never wore the coveralls, but I kept a toothbrush in my pocket. When you didn't have food, you had to have a toothbrush. So he said to me, I told him, I said, well, I got to go back to class. So he said, well, now there's some students over there on the other side of the church from Mather Academy, from which I had graduated. They would like for you to lead their march. Well, I said, I'm not going to march today because I can't go to jail today. I said, but I'll go over and speak to them. So I went over to speak to them. And they were just determined that they had come all the way over here from Camden. They wanted to march, and they wanted me to lead the march. So I made a little pact with them. I said, okay, I'll march. I'll lead you. But when we get down to the State House, and Chief Strom comes out and tells us to turn around, we're going to turn around. Deal? They said, deal. So we started to march. We got right out in front of the State House, And here came J.P. Strom. He raised his hands. Now, Cliburn, this is as far as I'm going to allow you all to go. And just as he said that, David Carter started preaching that sermon you just heard, telling these students why they should march. And I turned around and said, okay, students, it's time for us to go back to, oh, no, we ain't going back. David Carter won that one, and it wasn't long before we were off to jail. About 2 o'clock that next morning, we all laying there waiting to get bailed out. One of the students came over to me, and one had been so much wanting to go to jail. And he asked me, he says, I thought we were going to get out of jail. I said, yes, we're going to get out. He said, when? I said, as soon as Reverend Ida Quincy Newman raised the bail money. He's out there trying to raise the money. We'll probably get out by sunup. So he left. He came back a little later, and he says, now, who did you say was out raising the bail money? I said, Reverend Newman. He said, well, he's back over in that corner over there. Well, needless to say, it was 3 days later before we got out of jail. And I spent those 3 days and nights in my little 3-piece olive green suit without a toothbrush. And when I got back to campus that 3 days later, I peeled off that suit right in the hallway, and I've never put it on since. But I learned a tremendous lesson that day. I said in my memoirs that all of my experiences have not been pleasant, but I've considered all of them to be blessings. I was blessed with that experience that day because I learned on that day that all of us have roles to play. My role was to go to jail that day. Ida Quincy Newman's role was to raise the bail. So I learned on that day when the roles get mixed up, bad things happen. I hope that I can play a role in bringing the real story of South Carolina to those who would benefit from it. Thank you so much, and Godspeed.
Congressman, thank you so much for the gift of your papers to our library. We are very proud today. To all of you, thank you for being here at the beginning, and that's what this is. We have a long ways ahead of us and much hard work to do to bring this center to its fulfillment, but we are going to get there.